out there. This is Michael McCormack, and I'm a musician and film composer, having also co-produced The Shark is Still Working, which can be found currently on the Jaws Blu-ray in 4K. And basically, I'm building a YouTube channel for film fans. And at the end of the day, I guess I'm just, I'm kind of a movie nerd. And I have a feeling I have a kindred spirit here with me today, and that's going to be Ray Morton. Now, Ray Morton has been involved in the entertainment industry for over 30 years. He's also a very successful author and film historian. He's written books on the making of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, A Hard Day's Night with the Beatles. He's written books about how to screenwrite and direct. But the book that put him on my radar, and it's a book that I've purchased for a number of friends, and I never would have ever dreamed that I'd be speaking with them like I am here today. That book is King Kong, The History of a Movie Icon, which chronicles in detail the making of 7 King Kong movies, from 1933 to my beloved 76 Kong, all the way up to Peter Jackson's film in 2005. And I guess we'll start our conversation today on the current state of the Universal monsters. We wanted to talk about the Universal monsters. We've been messaging each other about it, and we feel like people maybe aren't as aware of them or aren't discussing them as much as we'd like. So we wanted to take you on a tour of the Universal Monster film series. Ray, I was wondering if you could start out. How were you introduced to the Universal monsters? I guess early in your childhood. What are some memories you have?
It's interesting because my relationship with the Universal monsters, it ties in directly with my interest in film. And how that happened was when I was in 6th grade, I had a teacher who she was rummaging through a closet, and she pulled out a Super 8, or actually it was an 8mm movie camera, and she held it up and she was getting rid of it. And she said, "Does anybody want this?" And nobody put their hand up. And I thought, well, I'd like a free camera. So I put my hand up, and she gave me the camera. And I figured out how to use it. And I decided that I wanted to make a movie with it. And I wanted to make a fictional movie, not just a travelogue kind of thing. And kind of around the same time, in the library of the school that I was attending, they had a book called Monsters of the Movies by a guy named Thomas Ellsworth. And it was a little paperback, and it was written for elementary school kids. But it had all the pictures. I had pictures of all the different monsters, including King Kong, my favorite, for other reasons. But it had great pictures of the Universal monsters, especially Boris Karloff as the Frankenstein monster and Lon Chaney Jr. as the Wolfman. And I was so intrigued with that. And at the same time that I had this movie camera, that I started to look up information about the Universal monster films in order to understand more about it, thinking maybe I'd make a monster movie. And right around this same time, I saw my first Universal monster movie, which I lived in the New York State area, in the New York City area, I'm sorry. And the Channel 9 in New York, WOR, they had all the rights to the Universal movies. And so this one Saturday afternoon, I saw Son of Frankenstein, which was my first Frankenstein movie, my first Universal movie. And I just loved it. I was blown away by it. I loved how it looked. I loved how exciting it was. I thought Karloff as the monster was great. So all those 3 things, actually went out and made my own little version of Frankenstein. Didn't come out very well. And then pretty soon after that, I started doing the thing everyone did in the pre-video era, got a TV guide, and every week I would go through the TV guide and circle all the different monster movies that would come on. And probably within a year, I had seen most of the major ones, and not all of the subsequent films. But I saw enough of them that I was really well versed, and at that point, I was just hooked from then on.
That's awesome. I totally used to do the same thing where you get the cable guide and,
Yep, yep.
and circle. And of course, you mentioned WOR, Channel 9 in New York. Of course, they used to have Fright Night. Remember that with that great intro with all the different monsters, including Frankenstein and Dracula. That was great. Yeah. It's funny you mentioned it started with books. For me, as a kid growing up in the 70s, and there was kind of a resurgence of the Universal monsters in the 70s, but there was I don't know if you were still around in school to see these, but there were an orange and black and white set of books from Crestwood House by an author named Ian Thorne. And just like you were describing, they had all these great pictures of the iconic monsters, and even had one for King Kong. On the cover of their King Kong book, they had the 76 Kong, which
Oh,
just
I've
blew me
seen that
away.
one. Yes, yes, I'm familiar with it.
So whenever I'd go into a library, I'd go directly to the monster section. They had Godzilla, Frankenstein, Dracula. You can find them on eBay. They're really fun to look at
Yeah.
and reflect on. The thing that really got me hooked was the Remco line of Universal Monster action figures that came out around 1980.
Okay.
And I remember just going into a toy store and just seeing, a whole big rack of, I think there were about 8-inch figures, and then they had little action figures that were this three and maybe 3/4 inch action figures that were just the right size to fight with your Star Wars figures.
Perfect. Perfect.
And there were just the monsters were everywhere. Marvel Comics had the Monster of Frankenstein, and there was a 12-inch record I had, and so it's
Yes,
just
yes.
amazing how, I don't know, just right when I was growing up, they were just everywhere to be found.
I was the second generation monster kid. The original generation of monster kids was from the late 50s and early 60s,
Hmm.
because that's when Universal first released the movies to television. I was the second generation in the 70s, but I didn't have the Remco things, but I had the Aurora model kits. I had every single one of them.
Oh,
There was a newspaper that used to come out called the Monster Times. I had that. I had a bunch of issues of that. That was so much fun, and just on and on.
oh, of course, how could we forget Forey Ackerman's famous Monsters of
Famous monster.
Filmland? I mean, that was just unforgettable, those covers. So the monsters were kind of everywhere when we were growing up. So I guess we kind of got hooked there. Now, I believe there's 41 movies considered to be part of that classic Universal line of monster movies. What are some of your favorites?
I think the first three Frankensteins for sure. Although I saw them in reverse order. I saw Son of Frankenstein first, then I saw Bride, and then the last one I saw was Frankenstein. But I think those three are terrific. I think the Wolfman is just terrific. Also, the Wolfman is almost a Greek tragedy, which I think is great. Um,
Hmm.
I like all the subsequent Frankenstein ones for fun, but I think the first three are probably the best of the films. I like Frankenstein meets the Wolfman a lot. It's a great Wolfman movie. It actually is the movie that gives the character all of the characteristics everybody associates with him, sort of his tragic wanting to die. Like that all comes in actually in the sequel, not the original Wolfman. But I think, it's got its flaws, but that's a pretty decent one. Actually, kind of, I like the Claude Rains Phantom of the Opera. It's not exactly the Phantom of the Opera story. They did take some liberties with it, but
Hmm.
but it's a super entertaining movie on its own. I really like Werewolf of London. I think that's a terrific movie. Again, they hadn't quite gotten it right yet, but they were on their way to it. I even like Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which I think is a pretty decent Frankenstein movie. So,
Yes, yes.
yeah.
With a great Frankenstein, I always thought Glen Strange, just Boris Karloff, of course, is iconic, but Glen
Mhm.
Strange is kind of like the Roger Moore of
Yes.
Frankenstein. He's
Yeah.
like right up there. But as far as I'm with you on the Frankenstein trilogy, those first three movies, and Son of Frankenstein really doesn't get the acclaim it deserves. I mean, the way it's shot with all those lighting
Yeah.
angles, and there's just so much atmosphere in that. It really improves upon, or at least develops on the stylistic way James Whale shot his two Frankenstein films. So I'm definitely with you on that. But we have to go back to just before the official line of Universal Monsters came about, and we have to mention Lon Chaney. in
Yes.
his portrayal of the Phantom in Gaston Leroux's 1925 classic Phantom of the Opera. I'm kind of curious why that, along with Hunchback of Notre Dame, why those aren't kind of lumped in with the classic Universal monster movies, because I really think they, if you put a nice HD transfer of those movies out, I'm sure people would gobble those up in these box sets that keep coming out with the same material.
Yeah, I suspect it has to do with the fact that they're both silent. I think when they first released all the movies to television, silent films weren't included in that package. I think because they felt, the TV studio station owners wouldn't show them, and maybe audiences wouldn't respond. Silent movies kind of went through an interesting, once sound came in, they kind of really faded away. They only kind of started a revival in the 60s and 70s. So I think in that middle period, I just think the studio didn't want to deal with them. The other thing is, while Phantom of the Opera is available, it's available in kind of a bunch of weird edits, because it was one of those sort of troubled productions where there was a version when they opened the movie, and then they cut a lot of different shorter ones or rearranged things. So there's not really a definitive cut of that film, but there are many versions of it.
I know modern audiences might not want to contend with that silent stuff, but
Yeah,
still great films to check out.
it's hard to get anybody even to watch black and white movies now. So silent ones are even harder. But
Well, I was going to ask you your opinion on that, because do you foresee Universal colorizing these movies?
that's an interesting question. I think the colorizing trend has passed, but I mean, kind of what we know from the Dark Universe stuff, they do seem determined to bring them back in some kind of style that I don't think is really appropriate for them. They're trying to turn them into action movies and things. But you know what? With all the digital upgrades, it is possible that they'll try something like that at some point.
I mean, with all this AI technology, I know I've seen people are running like Nosferatu through processing, and there's actually some amazing copies on YouTube of Nosferatu, um, Hunchback, and Phantom of the Opera. If you want to check these movies out, they are out there on YouTube. You can watch them for free, and
Okay.
of course, add them to your collection on Blu-ray. So anyone out there that might be listening. It's funny you mentioned the Dark Universe. I was so excited when they brought that up, but I feel like that they just don't get it. You've got to stick with tradition
Hmm.
and those iconic Jack Pierce makeups and creature designs. You've got to at least, you can pull them forward. I did like what they did with the Benicio del Toro Wolfman movie as far as the creature design. I thought he looked great. He looked like a classic Wolfman. But if you do Frankenstein, he's got to have the flat head. He's got to
Yeah.
have the bolts. Do you think they'll ever get that off the ground?
Well, I don't think Dark Universe is going to get off the ground. I think that pretty much has been put on the shelf. What they are trying to do now, and the only one that's come out is The Invisible Man, but they kind of farmed them out to Blumhouse. And the idea is they're going to do these standalone, um, modernized versions. I know they're working on a modernized Frankenstein. They signed, I believe it's Ryan Gosling, I think, to do a Wolfman. But I think the idea is to do them all in present day, and to do them, I think, in a low budget fashion, because the Blumhouse version of Invisible Man, it did well, it got good reviews. I I think what they're missing, in my opinion, and it's where Dark Universe went awry, and I'm hoping, this one, hopefully they'll remember this. The thing that's great about the Universal monsters, and why I think they remain so um, iconic to the people who really love them, apart from the makeups, which are amazing, is that they are all tragedies, and you have to write them and make them that way. All of the monsters, maybe except for Dracula, are sympathetic in some way. They're all kind of victims of fate and or of other circumstances. And I think, if you pare away the horror trappings, they are tragic films. And I think that the problem is, whenever in later generations, they just made monsters, creatures that would kill people. And then the slasher era came in, and that stuff could be fun, but, they're kind of, anonymous monsters. They're kind of there, and they come after you, and they're unstoppable, but there isn't any heart to them. And I thought the problem with the Mummy movie that was supposed to kick off the Dark Universe was that they made it an action picture and maybe a superhero picture. Not an illegitimate way to go necessarily, but I don't think it has much to do with why the Universal monsters are so beloved. So
I'm with you. I think these movies, they're very linear. They're very simple. There's not a lot of them developed out of stage plays.
yes.
So they're very lean and mean. In these movies, they question so many things about our existence, life and death, and their ambitions, the acceptance of others, their sexual undertones. Just explores so many, elements of the human condition, and it does it in such an imaginative, just ingenious way in how they created these wonderful makeups and sets. It's really something that if you're out there and you haven't, just sat down and watched these movies, you really should invest some time, because all the things that you like now, the Marvel movies, the cinematic universes, these things are kind of rooted in the Universal monsters. The Hulk, for example, was Frankenstein, or
Yes.
inspired by Frankenstein. They're even the same color.
Yes.
Um, they're really something that to check out. Um, so I guess going back to the beginning, kind of just working our way through some of these films. As far as Dracula, of course, we have that classic Bela Lugosi performance. What do you think he did there that raised the awareness of Dracula to where he is essentially that iconic image?
I think I think it was the look. I mean, that look is so elegant and so sort of perfectly upper class, well to do, and yet at the same time, with the pallid makeup and the white face and all, I mean, it's the death image. I think he combines an elegance to the menace. I don't know that it's actually a great performance. I think it's a great visual. I actually think his performance in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which is the only other time he played Dracula, is actually much better. But I do think it's hard to escape just what a striking figure he was in the original Dracula.
Right. And that voice.
It was exotic, just exotic enough, I think, that it gave it an otherworldly feel, like you said, with the voice, with the look, and all of that.
But apparently that movie was kind of like the Basic Instinct of its time. It was like turning people on.
Yes.
They never, experienced anything like that. And this is pre-code, these movies, before the movie code really kind of came in and spoiled some of the fun.
The thing
But
with, like, if you've read the novel Dracula and then you've seen Nosferatu, Dracula is always considered a repulsive character. He's not supposed to be dreamy and sexy and romantic. And while I don't know that the 1931 Dracula fully milks that, Lugosi himself is such a romantic figure. And I think because they couldn't go full on with gore in those days, in a way, the restraint makes his attack on the women much more sexual, much more seductive, I think. So I think that's the movie where the vampire as a romantic figure probably took root.
right. But Nosferatu, I'm glad you bring that up. I mean, if you're looking for a gateway into silent films, I'd recommend that to be the starting point, wouldn't you?
Yes, absolutely. I think it was my gateway into silent films. They showed it. It was a PBS station in New York City that showed that like 3 times a year. I was just blown away by it the first time I saw it, and anytime I can, I will watch it again.
That's great. As far as Frankenstein, what are some things that just stand out to you about that particular one? Because it's so iconic.
Right. I think a number of things. I mean, obviously the makeup and the image of Karloff is just striking, and we'd never seen anything like that before. And one of the things that I think is so interesting about that version of the makeup, because obviously it was reused on Karloff with modifications in the next two films and then adapted for the other actors. That's the one time when you see that makeup where, to me, what it actually looks like is what it's supposed to be. It looks like they got a dead guy, they put a guy together out of pieces of dead bodies and then brought it to life. Like Carla, the makeup has like an organic look to it that it never quite had again. It tended to look like really cool monster makeup. That time it looked like it was a realistic person, and I think that makes it even creepier than all of the other versions. So I think that's one thing. I think Karloff's performance is terrific. I think it has a pathos to it that that kind of later versions of Frankenstein turn him, even the Universal ones, turn him kind of into this lumbering robot kind of creature.
Yeah.
Karloff never played it that way. There's so much humanity in that character. Um, I think another thing that stands out is it's played deadly straight. You know, there's a little bit of humor here and there, like with Dwight Frye and with Frederick Kerr, but but it's unlike Bride of Frankenstein, which has sort of a camp quality to some of it. This one is straight on, deadly serious, and I think makes it all the more terrifying. I really love Bride of Frankenstein, but I'm not sure I think it's terrifying. It's more ironic. I think Frankenstein is an actually really scary movie.
Exactly. When you talk about the believability of it, one thing that I think is sorely overlooked is Colin Clive's performance. I actually recently saw Journey's End, which was made just prior to Frankenstein, and
Yes.
Colin Clive's great in that as an alcoholic military leader. And it's funny, and if you watch his performance in that, it's different in its tone, but there are qualities in it that I wonder if James Whale just kind of let him improvise some lines. One of my favorite scenes is when he's sitting there right before they reveal Karloff in his full glory, and he's like, I don't care if they do think I'm crazy, who just coming up with these ideas and whatnot. There is dialogue like that in Journey's End where he's kind of going, oh, if we could only see beyond the sky and space. So it must be something that he brought to that role, and he's just so deadly serious. He even played Mr. Rochester
Yes.
in an early version of Jane Eyre. So he's just a very overlooked actor, I think. And his performance, once he gets going in the movie, he just always hooks me in.
Yeah.
Really great performance, and he tragically just died a couple years after Bride of
Yes.
Frankenstein in 1935.
He died in 1937 of pneumonia, I believe. Or I think actually I'm wrong, tuberculosis, but it was
Mm-hmm.
exacerbated. I mean, he famously had a very terrible drinking problem. He actually when you talk about Journey's End, a lot of people felt that, I mean, he created that role on stage in London, and he had been in World War One, and a lot of people feel that a lot of what he brought to it was he had now we would call it PTSD, but
Mm-hmm.
back then they used to call it shell shock, and I believe he had a fairly serious case of PTSD, and that really informed his performance in Journey's End, and and that's what made Whale want him for Frankenstein. The original idea was to cast Leslie Howard, and when James Whale took over the project, he was like, "No, there's only one person I want to play this." And there's even a letter that Whale wrote to Clive, basically talking about how I kind of want you to bring Stanhope into this characterization, and he certainly did, and then I think took it to an even higher level. Stanhope's not quite as off the rails as Henry can get at some points.
Right, right. I guess the Mummy is often considered to be a remake of Dracula, just 1 year after that movie's release.
Yes.
Um, Any thoughts on that film?
It's a film that's grown on me over the years. This depends on how you come to the movies. I think I had originally seen some of the Lon Chaney mummy movies first, so I just figured all mummy movies were about a mummy, racing around or not really lumbering around, strangling people. So when I first saw the Karloff film, I was really thrown by the fact that the mummy's only in the opening sequence. And then after that, he plays obviously Ardith Bay. But so when I was a kid, I was disappointed in it, except that opening scene is so incredibly creepy and striking. And then after that, I was like, oh, I wasn't that interested. But I've rewatched it in recent years, and I actually think it's a better version. I think it is kind of the same story as Dracula to some extent, but I think it's actually a better done version of that story. I have kind of a newfound appreciation for Zita Johann, who
Oh yeah,
when I was a kid, she didn't make much impression on me, but she's pretty striking in the film as well.
yeah, I totally agree. Speaking of someone striking in a movie that came out, I believe, the same year, 1932, would be Gloria Stewart in an overlooked movie, and this is another one that I feel like ought to be lumped in with the classic box sets, The Old Dark House.
Yes.
With Gloria Stewart, directed by James Whale, has Boris Karloff. That movie actually has some pretty creepy moments.
Yep. 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 It has something very similar to what Frankenstein had. And one of the things another aspect of Frankenstein that I think makes it so effective is it not only doesn't have any music, but it was recorded in those early days when the sound recording wasn't that great. And obviously was done on sound stages, and there were echoes everywhere. Like when they're throwing dirt around, you just hear clumping and thumping, all of
Right.
which gave the whole thing a very eerie feel. And I think Whale carried that over into The Old Dark House, because that's another one where technically it's a bit crude, and the crudeness of the technical aspects, I think, just makes the movie even creepier than it already was. You know?
Right, right. And it's got a bit of humor, so it's kind of like a precursor to what we got with The Bride of Frankenstein.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. He was letting go a little more, James Whale, I think.
but wrapping up The Mummy, I just wanted to mention there is one terrifying scene in that always gets me, and that's when they're wrapping up Karloff. When he's
Yes. Hmm.
basically getting ready to be buried alive, or sealed up alive. That scene is like totally creepy.
It's hard, especially when they're covering his mouth, and you're like,
Yeah,
oh my god.
his eyes are like popping out, like very creepy. So the Mummy, more of an atmospheric classic than a monster run amok kind of movie. But speaking of a monster run amok, we got to mention Claude Rains and The Invisible Man from
Yes.
1933. What
Yeah.
amazing special effects and what an amazing performance. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, John Fulton, the Universal's visual effects guy. I mean, he really did a dry run for what became, very common effects later on. But that's the first time they did a lot of that, and it was actually on a couple of weeks ago, and it still holds up. Claude Rains is great. They cast him as for the voice, and I think they couldn't have cast a better one. And it's an interesting film. It's a little closer to what I would call sort of traditional James Whale, in that he mixes the horror with humor. But the humor is kind of a dark humor, and it really works. It's a very entertaining movie. I like it quite a bit.
I guess that one, as far as addressing a human condition, would be just a man's perception of himself and his ambitions and what
Right.
uh, he kind of goes a little haywire. Of
Yeah.
course, that I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I said I might be stretching it a little bit, but one of the things that's kind of interesting in that is, he's a man whose ego runs amok when he can't be seen, and it brings out the worst part of his character, and it makes me think of sort of the complaint about the internet, which is when people are anonymous and you can't see them, it seems to bring out a dark side of people sometimes. I might be
Wow,
stretching the metaphor a little bit there, but
dude, that's brilliant. That's brilliant, and that's true. That is true. Let's hope that they stay away from this video.
yes.
Those anonymous people. Uh, uh, But yes, that same year, just an amazing year for special effects. King Kong obviously came out
Yep.
1933.
Mm-hmm.
Do you consider that I mean, what's the deal with Universal and King Kong? I'd love to be able to lump it in. I know it's an RKO movie, but I'd love to
Yeah.
be able to lump it in there with my other monster movies from that era. Uh,
Well,
what's
I think I mean, when you're a kid, before you understand the difference between studios and companies and things, I just considered him one of the classic monsters. It was Frankenstein, the Wolfman, Dracula, King Kong, Phantom of the Opera, the Mummy. I just put them all in the same category, as did Aurora Models. They're all part of the same series. Um, I think it has a lot in common with the Universal Pictures in the sense that it is an exciting film. It is a big action film and a monster film, but it's heart of tragedy. And
Mhm.
I think the best monsters are the ones you feel something for. And clearly Kong's influence, to the point where the only time Kong's ever a monster is in the original 1933 film. After that, he's the hero, pretty much in
Yeah.
every Kong movie ever made. And I think that's what ties it with the Universal Pictures is there's this tragic heart at the center of it.
Yeah. Beauty and the Beast.
Yep. Hmm. Hmm.
Um, of course, I'm just trying to shoehorn King Kong in our conversation since I've got the King Kong guy here.
Shoehorn
Uh,
away, no problem.
but yeah, let's talk about King Kong for a moment. What is it about King Kong that just touched a nerve with you and touched your heart and imagination? Obviously, with you writing this great King Kong book that you have.
I love apes and gorillas. I just always have since I was a young kid. And I think for the reason a lot of people do, I mean, they're as close to humans as any other creature in the world can get. And so there's just something about, there are cousins to some degree. So I'm fascinated for that reason. I think when I first saw Kong, I mean, I got what everyone else got, which is you're watching this movie and it's quite scary all the way through, especially if you're a little kid. But then in the end, you're really sad. And I think as a young kid watching that film for the first time, I wasn't expecting that. And I think that's what kind of grabs people about Kong. I mean, obviously there's the size and every time I've talked to someone who's played King Kong in a movie, they always talk about how cool it is to, pick up miniature cars and things and throw them around and blow up stuff. So there's that sort of giant power part that I think is appealing. I think there's the kinship with the apes, but I think in the end, it's the emotion. It's the tragic heart of the thing that I think just really gets to people.
Yeah. What's your favorite sequence in King Kong that features the special effects?
Good question. I think the climax on top of the Empire State Building, I think it's just an incredible technical accomplishment. And I think I really, really like the log scene and the T-Rex battle or the
Yeah.
Allosaurus battle, depending on which expert you're talking to. But I think that fight is one of the greatest pieces of film they've ever put together.
Yeah. Whenever I'm trying to get someone to watch King Kong or understand why it's cool, I always pull up that T-Rex battle. I just
Yep.
thought the sound it's complemented in a way that there is no music, and it's just these monsters growling, and it's almost like you're transported to another time.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but
absolutely.
it's really that's they just didn't cut any corners in that movie.
No, no. Even though RKO wanted them to,
I'm
but they
sure.
didn't.
Um, so leading up to The Bride of Frankenstein, there's just a couple movies I wanted to mention real quick. Might not be as popular as Frankenstein and Dracula, but worth a mention. One in particular I really want people to check out. But Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff teamed up for first The Black Cat
Yes.
in 1934, and then again with The Raven. Now, both of these movies are very gothic and dark, but The Raven in particular, have you seen that?
I have, although I'll be honest, not in a long, long time.
You got to watch it again. It's
Yeah.
just so good. Bela Lugosi is just totally out of his mind, and he's obsessed with Edgar Allan Poe. and he's like, and he's hung up on he wants to avenge Poe. And like he's got this house full of blades falling and
Yes.
elevators that close in, and I think he even has a line. He has a line like, "I will avenge you, Poe."
Poe, you are avenged.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
It's so fun, and he is just out of control. And if you want to look at Bela Lugosi, why you hear people go on about Bela Lugosi,
Yes.
yes, of course you want to look at Dracula, but put The Raven on. It is great.
Yes.
Ray, you've
And
got to watch it. You've got to watch it this weekend.
I will look at it again. And the Black Cat is just one strange movie.
Very
It's
strange.
yeah, I mean it's a movie that's basically about incest and necrophilia. So all done in a 1930s package, but
With like a satanic element at the
yeah,
end. With
he's like a
it's
satanic black priest. It's
In fact, I think that's the Black Cat is where like the movie industry came in and developed the code system, which kind of
yeah.
put a damper on the creativity of these movies. So Black Cat, yeah, tore people up back then.
Yeah. Well, it was. I mean, I'll admit it's a little perverse even now. So I can see why the censors were a little shocked. I think.
Yeah,
So,
that deal at the end.
yeah.
Yeah, you'll be like, what are they? What exactly are they going for here?
Yeah. Yeah, and my understanding is it was all tamed down from whatever the original cut was. I'm like, well, boy, if that's the tamed down version, I can't wait to see what the unedited one was like.
That's a good double feature, Black Cat and the Raven.
Sure.
I might do that later. Um, so you had mentioned Werewolf of London,
Mhm.
which is often overlooked, but I agree there's some good stuff there.
I think I saw that before I saw the Wolfman, and it's an interesting movie. It doesn't 100% work, but again, this tragic thing. It has a really nice tragic heart to it, and I kind of like the battling werewolves aspect of it too. I think that was pretty clever.
Yeah, and the makeup, they refer to it as the Elvis
Yes,
werewolf.
exactly. Well, legend has it, and I actually got to get this confirmed with somebody who knows more about Pierce. I know Rick Baker does, but originally, supposedly, the makeup was pretty much the makeup he did for the Wolfman, but that Henry Hull refused to wear it. So they kind of had to tone it down so that because Henry Hull wanted to be more visible. So they kind of, the version they have now is a little more like Jekyll and Hyde-ish, I think. You can still see the person in there pretty clearly. He's not a full creature. But then Pierce got the chance a few years later to go back to his original concept when they did the Wolfman.
Yeah. Moving along to Bride of Frankenstein. Total shift of gears with this one. What's your impression there?
I mean, I think it's when I first saw the film, I was really thrown because I was not expecting the camp part of it, which is more prevalent in the early parts of the movie, mostly with Una O'Connor. I mean, all of her running around and screeching.
Mm-hmm.
I actually really didn't like it. And as the film goes on, I think she kind of fades away. And I think by the time the movie gets to its ending, for me, when I think of Bride, I think of mostly the end, which is where, she rejects him. I mean, it's the ironic part of the film. The woman made for him can't even stand him. I mean, that's heartbreaking. And I always think of that. And the other part that I think about is the part where he goes down into the crypt and he finds the coffin with the dead girl in it and he's trying to wake her up. He's calling her his friend.
Yeah.
Those are the parts of the film that stick with me emotionally. I'm not as big a fan of the humor in the beginning. Although
Mm-hmm.
the overall film has a much more fairy tale quality to it than the original Frankenstein.
Yeah. And putting it into modern terms, just if you're out there listening and you're trying to draw a connection, think about Halloween 2 in 1981. Everybody loves how Halloween 2 picks up right after the end of Halloween.
Yeah.
Well, Bride of Frankenstein does the same thing, and it's so cool. You've got a burnout windmill,
Yep.
and
Yep.
Frankenstein's hanging out down there. They had a couple of startling deaths when he throws that woman down.
Yes. She
Oh
just
my
bounces
gosh!
or slams or whatever.
Just
Yeah.
they pulled that off well. It's like, whoa.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, I'm with you on the Una O'Connor thing. I don't. James Whale must have really found her to be a hoot.
Yes.
um,
Pulling the invisible man, and then she's a little too much, I think, in Bride of Frankenstein. So
yeah, she's trying to avenge Poe.
yeah.
Um,
Right.
but for me, I love the scene with the blind man. Uh,
Yes.
so much humanity there, so much truth. Talk about tragic, because those two could have, had a good friendship and hung out.
John Carradine had to come along and ruin the whole thing.
So moving along from Bride of Frankenstein, I suppose we should mention the second Dracula film, Dracula's Daughter, which was originally intended to have Bela Lugosi.
Yes. Hmm.
But I don't know what went wrong there. Do you know anything about that?
I think it was a pay thing. I think the budget of the film was reduced, and they just didn't want to pay him his salary. So he ends up being represented in the film as a wax dummy, or there is a wax dummy that represents him. I find it an interesting film for a couple of reasons. The first is, like Bride of Frankenstein and like Halloween 2, it picks up exactly where the last film left off. And I'm always interested in that. Like, what happened 5 minutes later, right?
Right.
And I thought that was very interesting about it. It's also just a creepy film on its own. I don't know if it's a great Dracula film, but I also think it's but it is very eerie by itself. It's also the first major studio film, I think, that featured an unapologetic lesbian lead character.
Yeah. 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 I think the poster even had some line like, "She gives you that weird feeling."
Yeah, yeah, something like
Something like
that.
that.
Yeah,
Like something's a little offbeat here.
yeah.
Um, that one I need to watch again, but I do remember it did start right off with right after Dracula. So I'm gonna
Yeah.
have to check that one out.
That was the last one before the code kind of shut that off. The whole genre kind of went into a hiatus for a few years.
We did get one last great movie out of Son of Frankenstein,
Yeah,
um,
yeah. Which was
which
actually considered an A movie when it was made.
oh yeah,
We tend to look at it as a B movie now, but it was actually quite expensive, and it's a spectacular production. You know.
oh yeah, yeah, and you've got great performances by a number of people. Basil Rathbone as the son of Victor Frankenstein. Uh, Boris Karloff in his last performance as Frankenstein.
Hmm.
Uh, Bela Lugosi as Igor, which he really
Yeah,
made all he
steals the
could out of
movie.
that.
I think there are two great over the top performances in that movie, and Bella as Igor is one of them, and the other is Lionel Atwill, of course, as Inspector Krogh. I actually think Igor is Lugosi's best performance on film. I think he's so good and so wonderful in a way that he wasn't always in some of his other parts. I could watch him all day play that role.
He must have went into that movie kind of like tired of the Boris Karloff comparisons, or
Hmm.
maybe always being second fiddle to Boris Karloff in a lot of these movies. And it did stick, because how many years later, when we were growing up, we always heard there was like Dracula, Frankenstein, and Igor,
Right.
you know.
Yep. Yep.
So
Yep.
he definitely made an impression. I always like the scene where he's like, "Sorry, uh,
Right.
bone stuck in my throat."
Right. Yes. And then he's coughing on everybody, which is so
Yeah,
great.
yeah,
He also does great with the line where they keep talking about all the accusations. He goes, "I stole bodies. They said," and it's always "they said." I didn't really do it, but he's terrific in it.
people like trilogies, so really, again, that Frankenstein trilogy is really a good gateway into these monster movies.
I don't know if you know a lot about the production of it, but it's kind of an interesting movie in that they had a screenplay written for it, that they pretty much threw out. And while they were making the movie, they were basically, the movie that you saw is not the script. They made it up as they went along. The writer was literally writing on the set, and like the entire part of Igor isn't even in the original screenplay. And they hired Bela Lugosi for a couple of days, and the director was like, "Nope, I'm going to keep him on the whole time." So it's almost an improvised film, and I don't think you would ever know that watching it. It's because it's so well produced and pretty seamless. To think that they pretty much winged it always fascinates me.
Yeah, I didn't know that. That's really interesting. Because yes, it looks like a movie that's been thoroughly storyboarded
Yeah,
and thought through.
not at all. It was all kind of being done on a wing and a prayer, you know.
I believe you mentioned Lionel Atwill.
Yes.
Great performance as Inspector Crow. That famous scene where he's playing darts that was lampooned in Young Frankenstein with Gene Wilder.
Right.
Just again, all around, you've got all these various different types mixing in this movie just to make a great way to spend an evening watching that one.
It's all these great character actors who in other studios were kind of supporting actors. Like Basil Rathbone was always the villain in the Warner Brothers movies, and they just I think Roland Lee was an interesting director. He didn't make that many movies, but he had kind of a big epic style to it, much more epic than James Whale's versions. And he just let all those actors go to town, but not in a way where like it was getting away from them. They're just all doing absolutely their best. And Lionel Atwill, I don't think he's ever been better than he's in that film, and he's just marvelous in it.
Indeed. I guess we should stop at Phantom of the Opera. I love Claude Rains' performance. There's a little too much singing.
Yeah.
Again, it frustrates me that the 1925 isn't packaged in with these films. We always get this version.
Yeah.
You know, I'm always like, why not get both? But still, this movie does stand on its own. Has a very lavish Technicolor look to it. Just in a nutshell, how do you feel about the 1943 Phantom of the Opera?
I think we maybe mentioned previously is maybe a little too much singing, but other than that, it's again, it's a very different film than the silent version. Again, the Phantom is a tragic character. He's very sympathetic. What always strikes me the first time I saw it was there's the end where the whole cavern that he's living in is crashing down around him, and he ends up getting crushed by the rock. And then they zoom in on a shot of his mask. And to me, that sums up the film because it's so sad and so tragic. Yet it also is a film with a lot of spectacle in it. I don't know that the key part of every Phantom movie is the scene where the chandelier drops, you know. And I think that may be the best version of that in all of the many different versions of Phantom. It's big, it's epic, it's Technicolor. Claude Rains does a great job. It isn't. I don't think it's as much a pure horror film as the Lon Chaney version, but it's a very entertaining picture.
Yeah, he's got a cool mask in that one. It's
Yeah,
kind of it's kind of the flip of the Lon Chaney version, in that when he's unmasked, that's where he looks creepiest.
Yeah.
In this one, when he's got the mask on, he's kind of creepiest. Yeah, maybe the voice helps play into that.
Yeah,
but,
I think you're right.
It was a big hit back in the day, wasn't it?
Yeah, it really was. So much so that they actually started work on a sequel to it, and then they ended up dropping the sequel part, and they made a film called The Climax with Boris Karloff. But that began life as a sequel to that version of Phantom.
Awesome. That leads us to The Wolfman.
Yes.
With Lon Chaney Jr. making his mark, 1941. What you got to say about The Wolfman?
Again, I keep coming back to this, but almost a classic tragedy. That is the film that invented almost all of the lore people know about werewolves. People think werewolves are all about getting bitten by another werewolf, and you can kill them with a silver bullet, and all of the business about the pentagram and the full moon. And all of that was invented by the screenwriter Kurt Siodmak. For that film, werewolf legends before that have very little in common with any of that stuff. So I think it's what's, apart from the fact that it's a very entertaining movie, is that it is a movie that everybody thinks was capitalizing on ancient lore, and it's actually the film that created ancient lore. And I think that's kind of an amazing thing about it. I think Lon Chaney's really good in it, and it stars, my eternal heartthrob from that era, Evelyn Ankers, who is just wonderful in the movie.
Yeah. She was in a number of these films. And of course we had Claude Rains back as well as Larry Talbert's father.
Yes,
but
Sir John.
Yeah, they some family tree there.
Right.
Genetically. Claude Rains was like 5'6", and Lon Chaney Jr. is like 6'3".
Right. Yep.
Evelyn Ankers, from what I understand, she wasn't a big fan of Lon Chaney.
No, they paired them in many movies together, and they did not get along. Chaney was an interesting character. He was obviously the son of Lon Chaney, and he wasn't Lon Chaney Jr. He was born and raised as Creighton Chaney, and basically couldn't get a lot of work under that name. And the studios said, if you're Lon Chaney Jr., we'll hire you. So he became Lon Chaney Jr. And terrible drinking problem, and it got worse as he went on. He was known as a bit of a roughhousing kind of guy. I think he had a lot of personal issues, and depending on the film you see, I think sometimes he's quite wonderful, and sometimes he's quite stiff, and I don't know what the difference there is. But I think he's the only actor who ever played Larry Talbot. Every other Universal monster has been played by multiple actors, including Lon Chaney. He's the only guy who played Larry Talbot. He's also the only actor who played all of the other monsters. So he's pretty unique from that point of view.
From what I understand, he used to get drunk and have boxing matches in his trailer.
Yes, with Broderick Crawford, of all people. They would destroy the dressing rooms, and Evelyn had nothing. She didn't like that at all, and she was married to an actor named Richard Denning, and apparently there was some famous story where they were at some big banquet, and so Richard Denning and Evelyn Ankers were there, and Lon Chaney was there, and that was when the war was on. And Lon Chaney was giving Denning a hard time about his service, and apparently Chaney was making hints that Denning had was not in the service and was kind of a coward or something. And it turns out he was actually in and was a war hero. I don't know, something happened, but all I know is some ice cream got dumped on Richard Denning, and then that was the end of any tolerance that Evelyn Ankers had for him, for Lon. Yeah.
Yeah, you really get the sense when he's hitting on her in the movie.
Yes.
She's just not having it.
No, not at all.
It almost, in a way, like when she does finally, go for him, you don't really believe it, because you can really sense there's just not the chemistry there. It's not Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan.
No, that's a good. Yeah, not at all.
But it certainly launched Lon Chaney's career, and we'll gloss over these just in the interest of time. But of course, he followed up. They had him playing The Mummy. They had him playing Frankenstein and the Ghost of Frankenstein. They had him in The Son of Dracula, even, which was a bit of a stretch, although it is a good movie.
Well, someone said he's the most overweight Dracula anyone's ever seen, for a guy who lives on blood. But but it's not a bad movie. It's pretty interesting in its own right,
He doesn't really fit the role, but yeah, it does have that great. It has a great atmosphere to it, much more than a lot of the quote unquote B pictures.
Yes.
But moving on to probably the highlight of the B pictures, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, 1943. I know you mentioned that as one of the highlights for you. What's your impression of that film?
I think it's a terrific Wolfman sequel. Like we were talking about, when everyone thinks of Larry Talbot, they think of the haunted guy who only wants to die. and that's not actually his character in the first film. In the first film, he doesn't know what's going on. I mean, he thinks he's cracking up, but that tragic element of the Wolfman is brought in the second picture. It's a wonderfully directed movie. It's just atmospheric, and visually it looks great. I think it's Chaney's best performance in that role, and I think it is probably his best performance. It's got the best Wolfman transformations in it. The one in the hospital bed, and then later the one where he's standing against the tree. People don't remember, but in the Wolfman, you only see him revert from Wolfman back to human. You never actually see his face transform into the Wolfman. You do see that in Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. So I like all of that. The weak spot of the movie, as everybody knows, is Frankenstein. Bela was cast to play the role, and he was too old. He was in his early 60s and not in good health, so he couldn't really handle the physical aspects of the role. But also, coming off the end of Ghost of Frankenstein, the monster in the original cut of Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman could talk, because he could talk in the end of the movie. The problem is he talked in Igor's voice, which was a little off. And I think when they previewed it, audiences just couldn't take the talking monster. I think at that point they were so used to the silent creature, so they end up cutting out a lot of the monster scenes, and in the process, I think just cut Bela out completely for the most part. The monster, except for a couple of close-ups, is mostly played by stuntmen in the movie. And
That's true.
yeah, and so that part of it isn't particularly good, but all the rest of it, it's so well made and so atmospheric. It's a bit of a joke. Oh, somebody meets the somebody, right? I mean, it's become kind of a horror movie cliche, but they actually even come up with a fairly plausible script for it too. I don't know. It's the beginning of the Marvel Cinematic Universe too. So
It is innovative in that it's really the first team up
yes,
kind of film. When we talk about Bela Lugosi, one thing that is iconic whenever you go to a haunted house or you see Frankenstein at Universal Studios walking around, he's always got his arms outstretched.
yes,
And that's something that Bela, I guess, brought to it because he was blind.
yes.
And or the Frankenstein's monster was blind in the movie. So like he has his arms outstretched, and I see that all the time whenever Frankenstein's parodied or whatever. So he did bring that.
Yeah.
But stuntman, um, we don't have his name, but he did a good job
Yeah.
in the action scenes.
Yeah, there were two. There was a stuntman named Eddie Parker, and there's another guy named Gil Perkins.
Okay.
And if you actually look at the opening, not the opening, but the first time you see the monster, he's frozen in ice, and the Wolfman chips him out of the ice, and they do a shot of his face as he sort of lifts his head up, and he looks amazing. And it's not Bela. I think it's Gil Perkins, actually. And the makeup looks much more like the makeup they eventually put on Glen Strange. And he looks terrifying. And then when they cut to the next shot, when he's out of the ice, it's Bela, and he's nowhere near as terrifying. So
Yeah. But still, like you say, it's a great movie. You can smell the Halloween candy when you watch it.
yes, very much so.
Kind of developing on Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, we had House of, let's see, we had
Frankenstein first, yeah.
first we had House of Frankenstein in 1944, and then in 1945 we had House of Dracula.
Yep.
And this is kind of like Captain America Civil War of Universal Monsters.
Yeah.
Not really the best movies as far as the storylines, but just kind of a fun movie to put on a Saturday afternoon.
Oh yeah. Well, I agree. They're not great movies, and I do think they're probably the lesser of all of the Universal ones. But even there are some interesting things in it. Like the scripts are. I don't know about House of Dracula, but House of Frankenstein it's relatively intelligent for what it is. Like to bring all the monsters together sounds ridiculous, but they actually make it play fairly well. There's a decent Dracula subplot in the movie, and even Boris Karloff, who does not play the monster, he kind of brings to life a great villain character. So it's not a terrific film, but it's got its moments. And
Yeah.
House of Dracula does a really interesting thing that they kind of drop. Like, no one ever remembers this, but the scientist in that film takes a scientific approach to the monsters and ends up curing the Wolfman, which I think is kind of a really interesting way to bring that character kind of a happy ending of sorts. The movie isn't particularly good, and I think that gets overlooked in it. But it was kind of an interesting advance for that time. They were actually wrapping up the character in an interesting way.
Sure, sure. They're definitely worth watching, but you got to watch them. It's kind of like if you're going to watch like a Jaws sequel. It's
Yeah,
just
yeah.
you just kind of just if you're going to put King Kong Lives on, even that film has its merits. But before we go into that Pandora's box, let's move on to Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which is one of my favorites. I mean, this
Yep.
this is kind of like what I felt like House of Dracula and House of Frankenstein were wanting to do. It just seems like everyone's just up their game with Glen Strange as Frankenstein, Bela Lugosi back as Dracula, and it's just so funny and atmospheric, and just a great movie to kick back and watch.
Yeah, I am not, this is not an original observation by me, but what I think makes that so effective is Abbott and Costello are really funny in the movie, and obviously that was their stock in trade. And the monsters are all played straight, and you would think that that mixture wouldn't work, that it should all be either funny or it should be serious, but the mixture, they get it right. And the only other horror comedy I think that ever really gets it that right is Ghostbusters, because you can watch Ghostbusters as a entertaining supernatural movie. You can also watch it as a great comedy. You can do the same thing with Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, and the funny parts are really funny, and the monster parts are just, especially when the Wolfman comes in. They're scary enough for that late in the cycle.
That would be a good double feature. Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, and then you watch Ghostbusters.
Oh yeah,
That's a good double feature there.
I'd be there for that for sure.
Of course, they made some other movies, Meeting the Invisible Man, and who else did they meet? The Mummy.
Yeah, they met the
uh,
Mummy, and they met Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and a very weird titled movie, Abbott and Costello Meet the Killer, Boris Karloff. I that one's not even a horror movie. That's more like of a mystery though. But the title is very strange.
I mean, I know that Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. I think I saw somewhere where it was like the fifth highest grossing movie of that year. So those movies must have been, they kept making them, so they must have been very profitable for the studio. But of course, at that point, that's just totally you're making the Universal monsters not scary now. So
Yeah,
you're kind of cashing in your chips there. And I guess after World War II, monsters just kind of weren't as scary as real life horror.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
which with the 50s ushered in this new age of nuclear threats and radioactive monsters, giant monsters. But we still did get one last great Universal classic monster in the creature from the Black Lagoon, which I originally saw this in 1981. There was a rescreening. It was 80, 81, and it was in 3D, and the 3D worked.
Okay.
And it scared me to death. I was
Yep,
still
yep.
a little kid, and with him walking straight out, when he's chasing Julie Adams around, and he's
Yeah.
walking straight into the camera with those claws out, with those gills and that face, it was terrifying.
Yeah.
It was so good. What makes Creature from the Black Lagoon work for you?
I think the design. I think it's an amazing design that really, really works. And I think again that I mean it's a little odd, the I guess the sexual attraction between the creature and Julie Adams. I mean they don't quite spell it out, but that's obviously what it is.
You can't blame him.
That's true. That's true. But I think that he brings about his own demise because of that. So it has sort of that King Kong element to it. And then there's that amazing, the dual swimming, the swimming ballet, where he's swimming below her, which the scene is sexy and then it's scary.
Right.
I think it hits on some of those 50s movies cliches a little more than the other Universal monster movies do, but it still gets to that weird tragic heart. And I that's why I think we remember it. That and that amazing design.
I might be wrong, but I think it's Henry Mancini did some of the music for that.
Yep.
And it's got that great bum bum bum.
Yeah, I don't think that was him. That might have been Frank Skinner, because a bunch of people did the music for it. But
Yeah.
you always remember it.
Yeah, they like play that and everything. I remember there was a John Belushi sketch. He was the thing that wouldn't leave. He was like
Wouldn't leave.
and he's sitting on the couch eating popcorn. Hey, what's the next movie coming? And the people that are having him over are like, he won't leave.
Right.
And they play that Trina. It's so funny. But definitely a classic. Of course, there were 2 sequels. You're going to have to go check them out, folks. If you're not sold at this point, Ray and I just give up.
I will say, like, the second Creature movie, it's okay. It's a pretty typical sequel. The third one is not a great movie, but it is wacko. That's the movie where they operate on him and turn him into sort of half a human. I don't know. I still can't quite sort it out, but I found that just very disturbing when I was a kid. I didn't know quite what to do with that movie. So
yeah, when I watch like Revenge of the Creature, I'm more caught up in the love triangle those guys going after Lori Nelson. But who could blame them there as well? But anyway, there's certain movies that aren't part of the Universal monster legacy, but kind of play right along with them. Did you have any movies like that you've seen from that 1930s, 40s era that you think kind of fit in with the Universal monsters?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think the 1932 Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, directed by Ruben Mamoulian, is a marvelous movie and an inventive film, and it fits right along with the characterizations in the Universal pictures. It's also a pre-code movie, and it is really sexy in some places. Like Mary Hopkins is amazing in the movie. I would say Island of Lost Souls is another one. The original Island of Dr. Moreau, the first version. Island of Lost Souls is a creepy and disturbing movie, and very, very well done. That was an RKO movie, I believe, or maybe Paramount. I'm not sure, but it was not Universal, but it's kind of in the same vein as the really early ones. And then I think the other one is the MGM. Well, there's a couple of Warner Brothers ones, House of Wax and Dr. X. And they're a little more straight horror. They don't have the tragic heart that Warner Brothers, that the Universal Pictures have. But they do have Fay Wray. So that's, they've got the Scream Queen from King Kong. And then the last one that I think fits in there is Freaks, the MGM picture.
Exactly. One of us, Google Gobble.
Yeah, I mean, that is a really disturbing movie. But it really is.
Like when they snap and you know what they're up to. Oh.
Yeah. Scene in the Rain. Oh my Lord.
Yep.
So, yeah.
You can even compare that to a lot of movies they make today. I mean, it's just there's some freaky stuff there, and you can't just write it off as, oh, it's an old movie, it's black and white, or it doesn't have The Rock in it, or whatever. I mean,
yes.
You just turn all that crap off and go back. This is the seed of our pop culture in a lot of ways. But I'm with you on Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. That movie is savage. I mean, it
Yeah.
doesn't pull any punches.
Nope. It
And
goes for its horror, but it has like great human characters in it, and the filmmaking is so inventive. Mamoulian just was pulling out every trick he could come up with, and they all work great. It's a marvelous film.
the only other movie I would really add into that, I suppose, would be Mark of the Vampire. With,
Yes.
and the reason I would recommend that is just if you're wanting to see Bela Lugosi as a vampire.
Yeah.
And it does have a nice atmosphere to it. And it was also directed by Tod Browning, who
Yeah.
had done the original Dracula.
We should also probably mention Spanish Dracula.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was, for anyone who doesn't know, it didn't last very long, but in the early sound era, they would sometimes shoot an entire foreign language version of a film that they were already making because they didn't have the technology to dub back then. So what they did is, while they were filming Dracula, an entirely separate crew filmed at night a Spanish language version, and the consensus is, which I agree with, is that the Spanish language version is actually a much better made movie than the English language. The only difference is that the lead in the Spanish language version does not have near the charisma of Bela Lugosi. So if you could put Bela Lugosi in the Spanish language Dracula, you'd probably have the perfect Dracula film.
And let's throw in Lupita Tovar
Yes,
in there as well. She's kind of the precursor to Salma Hayek.
I definitely.
She looks amazing in it, and a lot more camera movement in the shots on the Spanish Dracula, which was actually directed by an American, George Melford.
Right. Yes, that's correct.
And Dracula was portrayed by Carlos Villieres. But yeah, he's kind of he's a little more toothy, a
Yeah.
little bit more of a monster, I guess. Not
Yeah.
as romantic.
Yeah. He didn't have the elegance that Bella had, so.
Yeah, so I guess that would be a good way to contrast, what makes Bela Lugosi's Dracula, like we were talking about earlier, what makes his so special. As far as again your books, we want to make sure folks check out your work. I can't recommend, and this is not just I have had that King Kong History of the Movie Icon book out and about on my shelf. Again, I've bought it for friends. I can't recommend that book enough. I was going to ask. I know we've had some activity with King Kong lately. Just real quick, what are your thoughts on King Kong and his resurgence in popularity recently?
I'm always glad for him to come back. I want modern audiences to love the character. I'm not nuts about the movies, but I'm not sure what I did not like Skull Island much at all. I thought Godzilla versus Kong was a little more in the vein of an old fashioned, kind of monster punch up movie, but they I don't know, they're missing something for me.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say it seemed like Skull Island was kind of tapping into story elements of King Kong Lives in a way.
A bit, yeah, a bit. Like they seem to have more in common with those kinds of sequels. I just, Kong isn't really a major character in the movie, which I think is maybe what threw me. They go to the island and they're running around, and that's fine. And Kong kind of wanders through every once in a while. He's obviously there in the beginning when he attacks the helicopters, which is a pretty cool scene, and he's there in the final battle. But otherwise, he doesn't have much to do in the movie. So I guess maybe that's what threw me about it. I thought Godzilla versus Kong had a wonderful element that I wish they did a little bit more with, which is the idea of the little deaf girl who could speak sign language to Kong.
Yeah.
Because I think a good King Kong movie, you have to have some sort of human connection in it. And I thought that was such a good idea. I just wanted them to do more with it, and they didn't quite. So
Yeah, it started getting interesting towards the end for me. I did like the fight at sea.
Yeah.
But again, when we talk about these older movies, and I get it, we like technology and whatnot. I just don't. I can't get into CGI. It's just not.
Yeah.
If it's not an actual, even if it's a guy in an ape suit, I know it's an actual physical thing that people are, contending with, and I just can't get into it as much. I feel like I'm kind of watching a cartoon.
Yeah, I think that probably has a lot to do with why they don't stick with me, because in the end, I don't know what I'm looking at exactly.
Yeah, and there's just so many different plot elements and characters that are kind of shoehorned in. They need to kind of go back to basics and just do linear. I was thinking about the new Halloween movie, and there's just always all these different plot. No, you put people in danger of this monster.
Right, and then let them go to town.
Yeah, that's
So
what people want to see.
yeah.
So, but I am curious if you're looking at maybe expanding your Kong book to include all these new movies, maybe.
Can't say much, but I will say that that's probably happening.
That's
Yeah, so it'll be a little bit, but I think you may see that come about.
Oh, that'll be awesome.
Yeah.
Well, you'll have to, of course, come back on and talk about that. And again, Close Encounters. You've got a great book on Close Encounters.
Thank you.
You want to tell folks about that real quick?
Yeah, well, that was a book I did in 2007 for the 30th anniversary, and I wanted to do a detailed history of the making of that film because it's one of my all-time favorite movies. And I got to interview and talk to so many great people who created that film, and I got to learn the real story of how it was made, and hopefully, presented that well for people who weren't familiar with it. But I had so much fun working on that project, and I people did seem to like it, and I was really pleased about that.
That's great. I'll put links to your books in the description on the video. And then we also have to talk about real quick, you've got commentaries that you're doing, which are just great. And I'm, in fact, just what was it, about a year and a half ago, I
Yeah.
remember listening to your commentary on the Scream Factory King Kong Blu-ray that came out, and you did a great job there. So you're on the Scream Factory Blu-ray of King Kong 76, and then I believe you've got some more news for us regarding your commentaries.
Yeah, I just finished one for a Blu-ray for King Kong Lives, and that is being put out by an Australian company. I am not sure if where its distribution is going to be. I get a little confused with all those regions and things. It may be a region-free disc. I'm not sure, but that will be coming out in January, and that is the first time King Kong Lives has ever been put on Blu-ray.
That's
So
great.
either it'll be available here, or perhaps it'll have them release a version here. But yeah, I just did the commentary for that, and that was a lot of fun to revisit that as well.
I believe that's Umbrella Entertainment.
Yes, that's
If
correct.
anyone wants to look at that, I think it comes out in January.
Yeah.
So we've got that, and then they're putting out King Kong on 4K
Yeah,
this month.
yeah, that's actually it's a European disc, but it'll be region free, so you'll be able to look at it here too. And basically, it is the same package as the Shout Factory. They Kong has a really all the Kong movies have a kind of a complicated rights situation, but the Dino De Laurentiis Kong 76, it is the rights in the United States and Canada are owned in perpetuity by Paramount, but everywhere else in the world it is owned by Studio Canal. So the Shout Factory disc was licensed through Paramount, and Studio Canal licensed its own version. But apparently, they were so pleased with the Shout Factory disc that all of the extras are going to be ported over to the European version. So my commentary is going to be on that track as well.
That's awesome. So we've got lots of great King Kong stuff going on. I got to say, well, real quick, one thing I love about King Kong Lives is the score by John Scott.
Yes, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I just think that is just, man, again, talking about somebody swinging for the fence.
Yeah. You could make a good argument that it's the best element in the film. Like, I think it captures what they wanted the rest of the film to capture, that it doesn't always. But I find I could listen to that score over and over again. I think it's quite great.
All right. So again, ladies and gentlemen, be sure to look out for Ray's books and his Blu-ray commentaries for the King Kong Lives. Again, links will be in the description of this video. Thanks to Adam Long from Movie Geeks United. Adam is a friend of mine and Ray's, and he helped us connect. And be sure to look for our King Kong video, the video I did with Adam Long about the 1976 King Kong, if you can, on this channel. I hope you'll subscribe and hang out with us. And we'll be back again, hopefully, with some more movie commentary for you. So you have a good rest of your night. And Ray, it's been great talking with you, sir. Appreciate
Thank you
it.
for having me. I very much appreciate it.
All right. Well, you have a good night, and thanks everyone for listening. Bye-bye.